What is up, my spooky mates of YouTube? Marcel from Aussie Horror here, and in today's video I'm going to be recommending 5 underrated horror movies that you should check out if you haven't already. So, if that sounds good to you, let's get into the video. Starting things off from 1990, we've got Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead. Now, I know there are a lot of genre purists out there that prefer the original, but in my defense, this is a very nostalgic pick for me simply because I was only like 7 years old at the time, and it was Halloween and it was midnight, and the 1990 remake of this came on a TV channel called TV1, and I remember watching that movie and I was just enraptured with it. Patricia Tallman's performance as Barbara in this movie and Tony Todd's performance as Ben, those two performances are incredible and they really sell the movie itself.
Coming to get you, Barbara.
This is gorier than the original, it's more dramatic than the original, although I must admit the black and white of the original is hard to beat, and I do love the original, but the remake itself is just, in my opinion, a much more harrowing portrayal and version of Night of the Living Dead. You've probably seen the original, but you probably haven't seen the remake. If you haven't seen the remake, definitely check it out. Tom Savini used a lot of love when remaking Night of the Living Dead, and it shows in how faithful it is to the original, but it also sort of does its own things in certain places, which you will see when you watch the movie yourself. So if you haven't seen the Night of the Living Dead remake, definitely check it out. Next up, from 2005 by David Lightfoot, we've got Wolf Creek. This was a massive deal in Australia when it came out, but if you're outside of Australia, there's a good chance you haven't seen this one yet. John Jarratt's performance as Mick Taylor is iconic. It's arguably one of the best horror performances in the last 20 or 30 years.
Welcome to Australia, cocksucker!
And the character of Mick Taylor is so sleazy and, I was gonna say realistic, but not realistic so much, but this was sort of popular when movies like Saw and Hostel were popular. It isn't a torture porn film per se, but it is very realistic in its portrayal of violence. It's less bloody and more just graphic, if that makes sense to you. The movie itself is definitely worth checking out, and you know it was successful because it got a sequel and then a TV series about it. I haven't seen the TV series, but Wolf Creek 2 is also worth checking out if you like the original. It's a piece of Australian horror cinema, and we don't really get a lot of that, so definitely check this one out. Next up, from 2009, from Tommy Wirkola, we have Dead Snow. This is a splatstick film in the vein of Evil Dead 2. If you loved the sort of horror comedy of Evil Dead 2, you will love Dead Snow. It's just sort of like that, that dark cabin in the woods type of vibe, except it's in a snowy environment. This was also sort of at the forefront of all the Nazi zombie media that was coming out, and I saw this in the cinema way back in the day. I don't know how they let me into the cinema, because when I saw this I definitely wasn't 18, and as you can see here, it's rated R18+. But yeah, it's gory, the performances are all funny, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and you'll love to see that in horror movies. It's a bit of Norwegian cinema, and I highly recommend checking this out. There's also a bunch of sequels as well, but they're not as good as the original. The original usually is the best. Next up, from 2002, we have Cabin Fever by Eli Roth. Now, when I was in school, I had like 2 other friends that liked horror movies. Nobody else I knew liked horror movies, but I had 2 friends that came out of the theater, and I didn't get a chance to see it in the theater with them at that particular time, and they had told me that this was the goriest movie they had ever seen, and they could barely stomach it. So I was really excited to see this one. I went into the cinema, and it was basically a fucking comedy, just with gore in it. It's basically a horror comedy, not too dissimilar from Dead Snow, but instead of like zombies or anything like that, it's more like body horror, gooey, gory, disease, makeup and prosthetics and special effects. It is a gory movie, but I think at that time, the goriest movie I'd ever seen was probably Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive. Still though, as far as an Eli Roth movie is concerned, this is fantastic. I prefer this to Hostel. There's just something about horror and comedy that goes together so well, and as Evil Dead 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time, I've got a soft spot for horror comedy. So if you like horror comedies, if you liked Eli Roth's other movies like Hostel or maybe even Aftershock, definitely check this one out. And finally, from 2016, we have The Void. If you like your cosmic horror, if you like H.P. Lovecraft, if you like a lot of that Cthulhu mythos stuff, definitely check this movie out. It's creepy, it's unsettling, it's sort of like a more art house style horror movie. I know they have been pretty popular over the last, I want to say 5 years, especially with A24. But if you want something that's got some decent gore in it, but it also has that cosmic horror, Lovecraftian vibe, I am an absolute sucker for Lovecraftian horror, then I would highly recommend checking out The Void. One thing I want to say is that the special effects in this are fantastic. Of all the movies that I've mentioned today, this easily has the best special effects. It does have some CGI in it, but it's really tastefully done. I'm not going to spoil anything about this movie because you're really going to want to go and see this fresh, so definitely check out The Void. Anyways, what are your top 5 most underrated horror movies? Let me know in the comments below. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say, and until the next video, my name is Marcel from Aussie Horror, and I'll catch you guys around.